Hello students, welcome to the final video for the semester for the Administrative Process and Ethics class. This video here is primarily going to just review very quickly how to take your answers from quiz number 2 and translate those answers into a good PowerPoint presentation. To start, let me remind you about this video, which is what I used in order to describe what a critical analysis paper is. We start off by saying "they say." We continue by saying "this paper says." We don't say "I say." You don't use first person in a research paper. So in this case here, "I say" would be translated to "this paper says," "this research supports," "this research claims," "the theory presented here claims." That's the equivalent of saying "I say." And then at the end of your critical analysis paper, you tie it all together. So let's get started on how this translates into a presentation so that it's a good PowerPoint. We're going to use these sections here to guide you through the PowerPoint presentation the way I do it. Everybody has a different way of doing a PowerPoint presentation, so this is not something that's going to be useful for any other professor. Professors are all very particular in what they want and what they use as a teaching tool. This is what I use as a teaching tool. So this PowerPoint is going to focus on these 7 sections, and you'll see them in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen as I talk about each one of these sections in the PowerPoint presentation. In order to translate your quiz number 2 answers into this PowerPoint presentation, I need you to go through the answers that you gave for quiz number 2 and put these section breaks next to each one of your quiz number 2 questions. So question number 1, in my case, was part and parcel of my introduction. Question number 2 was part and parcel of my literature review, so was question number 3. Question number 4 was part of my evaluation and comparison section, and so forth all the way down this screen here. Now you can freeze the video if you want to write these down, or you can come back later and do that. But for the most part, you'll see this as I go through the presentation. So if you wanted to stop the video now and go grab your quiz number 2, you can be writing in the margins here to so that you have that available as you put together your own slides in a proper narrative sequence, and that's what we're all about here. So here's the way question number 8 through 12 translated into my section breaks for my PowerPoint presentation, and here's my section breaks for questions 13 through 18. Now I'm going to move fairly quickly here. This is, look in the bottom right hand corner, part of my introduction. Your opening slide should be your title slide. Make sure your name is on it, because I can't give you points for your name if you don't put your name on your PowerPoint presentation. As I mentioned in the quiz, and as I made clear in the quiz, your thesis statement, and in addition to that, your title, in a large degree, is going to be contingent upon how you actually flesh out your narrative and complete this PowerPoint presentation. So to create a title at this point in time and to be cast in stone and committed to it like a firstborn child would be a mistake. So the title slide is something that I would like you to come back to at the end after you've done almost everything else in the presentation. You can have a working title, but let's make sure you call it only a working title. So we're going to come back to this title slide at the end of the presentation. And the same thing goes for your thesis statement. Your thesis claim is part of your introduction. You're going to open up your presentation by talking about this in ways that it communicates your thesis to your viewer without necessarily reading your thesis statement word for word. So once again, your thesis statement is not going to be cast in stone until you're actually done your PowerPoint presentation and your rough draft. So let's come back to that as well. Question number 5 of quiz number 2 was where I asked you to talk about the crisis. In my case here, I'm going to talk about the San Francisco police chief having to fire 8 officers over their text messages. This was a crisis which had its roots back in 2011 and 2012. As it says here, San Francisco police chief Craig Sewell said Friday he is moving to fire a captain, a sergeant, and 6 other officers implicated in sending and receiving reprehensible racist and homophobic text messages that came to light during a federal corruption probe. So in a way, I don't want you to be reading this. I don't want you to do what I did. I just gave this as an example of the crisis that I'm going to use. So what you're going to do, and what you will have already done as part of question number 5 on your quiz, was you already have this paragraph. and you already know how you're going to talk about your crisis. So this is how you open your PowerPoint presentation. And question number 6 asks you to do the same thing that you did for question number 5 on the quiz, but put it into bullet points. So here's my bullet points. The story took place in San Francisco. It's a current story, but the events trace back to 2011 and 2012. There were reprehensible texts, racist and homophobic, so make sure that that's part and parcel of it. But all I want is the bullet points. I want you standing up here like I'm standing here now, talking to me with these bullet points behind you or in front of my face while I'm listening to the audios. If you were in front of a classroom, your bullet points would be up on the overhead projector and you would be talking to the classroom. In this case, I'm going to be looking at your PowerPoint slide while your narrative plays in the background. So your narrative is not reading these bullet points to me. So imagine that you're reading these bullet points and I'm talking to you about this scandal or this issue that's taking place in the San Francisco Police Department and 8 men are getting fired. And it's over racist and homophobic tweets that were reprehensible. It involved the 8 officers, I already talked about that, and it could jeopardize court cases that relied on testimony from the officers linked to the ugly texts and the resignation and other disciplinary action. So I wanted to touch on all of those topics without necessarily reading them. Now I've only put like a couple of hours of presentation into this, so I had to read my teleprompter here in order to do that. I want you to have something a little different than that, so that I'm just looking at bullet points while you're talking in normal voice and giving me a narrative, telling me a story. Okay, question number 1 from your quiz gives you the type of crisis that it was, pulling this from page 417 of the Johnson textbook. In my case, this crisis was about a public perception. It had there were negative stories and rumors spreading about the policemen, these 8 policemen and plus 6 others in San Francisco, and mine was a human resource crisis as well, where there were internal pressures and collusion. These 8 officers plus 6 were dealing with each other in text messages back and forth. So it was a human resources crisis as well as a public perception crisis. It exploded into a public perception crisis, and you had to deal with those 2 crises together. Questions number 2 and 3 from your quiz talk about the 3 stages of the crisis. At this point in your PowerPoint presentation, I want you to deal with the pre-crisis. Tell me what happened on the pre-crisis and what happened at the actual crisis event. The human biases were inserting themselves in this case. There were institutional failures. It could have been circumvented if they would have seen them back in 2011 and 2012. And there were special interests, part of a larger corruption investigation. One of these officers only got caught because he got caught in a larger corruption scandal that the feds came in to investigate. The crisis event, what was the trigger? What took place that triggered this? Well, it was the corruption case that the feds came into, and the email messages and the text messages themselves only came out as part of this other investigation. Nobody went looking for the text messages. So that was the trigger event, the crisis event itself. The post-crisis events, we're not going to deal with that now because we are just launching, and you notice down here in the bottom right hand corner, the section changes at this point in time. This is how I'm introducing my literature review. I'm bringing you into the Johnson textbook at this point in time, and I'm telling you, my viewer, that we are now going to start looking into the literature about all of the foundational information that you're going to need as we go through this paper. Okay, still in the literature review section, we are now going to go through pages 430 to 441 of the textbook and pick 6 topics or virtues that came out of the textbook. Now, on pages 430 to 441, there are only 5 sections there, but there are chapters throughout the textbook that have taught you everything you know about those 5 sections that they talk about on pages 430 to 431. Assume broad responsibility. These are topics that we covered in chapter 2. Practice transparency. These are topics that we talked about and learned about in chapters 4 and 9. So you should be pulling your 6 virtues or ethics that you used to answer question 13 from these chapters in these 5 broad categories. So demonstrate care, that's something we learned in chapter 3 and chapter 5. Engage the head as well as the heart, those are things we learned in chapter 7 and chapter 10. And improvise from a strong moral foundation, these are things that we learned in chapter 1 and chapter 6. So pull your information that you're going to use in this literature review from these chapters based on these 5 broad categories which I asked you to deal with in question 3 of the quiz number 2. Questions number 17 and number 18 asks for 2 peer-reviewed sources as references outside of the Johnson textbook. So now, as you think about these 5 broad sections and these 6 virtues or concepts, you're going to have to go out and find other peer-reviewed sources that are going to support your claims that you've already learned about broadly in the Johnson textbook. So build a detailed analysis of the 2 major topics that you find out of these 6 virtues and categories that were part of the quiz. And that finishes the literature review section of this PowerPoint presentation. And so now we move into the failures in leadership. We've talked about the literature that is foundational to leadership virtues. And now we're going to talk about those failures in the leadership that specifically relate to this scandal in San Francisco where the police chief had to fire 8 officers, and there is a federal probe going on against the one officer who is now ensnared in a corruption scandal. And he was at the core of these texts. Where I would pull this from, and what guides me in this regard from the journalistic article that I found, are these 2 paragraphs here. So from these 2 paragraphs, I know where the failures in leadership took place. So find in your article, in your scandal, whoever's writing about it or talking about it, find what points you to the leadership failures and build from there. Question number 8 helps you in this regard because this is where you actually prepared the bullet points for this. So at this point, once again, you're going to have your bullet point slide sitting in front of you while you record this narrative for me in your normal voice. And you're not going to read the bullet points, you're going to tell me the story, and my eyes are going to follow the bullet points while you're talking. Going to do the same thing for organizational failures, the next section of your paper, and now the next section of your PowerPoint presentation. Question number 9 guides you in this regard, whereas you were supposed to give me the concluding paragraph about this section here. So build something around these lines. In my case, I found these lines in the story that talk about the organization, the San Francisco Police Department itself. So in this article, I found things that pointed me toward organizational failures, or the action, in this case here, these were actually organizational strengths that allowed them to uncover the corruption, albeit, maybe a year or 2 late. But they did uncover this corruption. They did uncover through their investigation of the corruption. Well, maybe they didn't. The San Francisco Police Department didn't actually find the texts themselves. It was the federal investigators who were probing the corruption scandal who actually found these texts that this guy was the instigator of. So there were organizational failures. If I were finishing my PowerPoint presentation on this story, I would dig them up. I would find the organizational failures, and in all likelihood, one of my peer-reviewed sources would probably deal at length with these organizational failures. But at the very least, I'm going to be pulling this out of the Johnson textbook. Question number 10, once again, this is where you prepared 5 bullet points or 6 bullet points on this topic. So you should have that slide already ready if you did quiz number 2 properly. And you may want to revise them now that you're watching this video and seeing a different way of doing it. But once again, this is part of your organizational failures section. From an organizational standpoint, why didn't somebody report this guy much earlier than they did? Why was he only exposed when the feds came in a corruption case? Okay, very short bullet points, probably a little long on this part, but once again, this is a PowerPoint presentation that I've put together in an hour, and I wanted it to be illustrative for you as you try and put these bullet points in. So if I were you, I would make these bullet points shorter than these ones that you see here. But once again, I pulled these straight from the journalism story itself as a guide for myself going into how I'm going to tell you about this and how I'm going to investigate the organizational failures. I had leads that sent me on my own investigation. Okay, so now we come back to the third point that we didn't deal with earlier that was related to questions number 2 and 3.
The 3 stages of a crisis. We've already dealt with the pre-crisis and the crisis event. Now that we're in this evaluation and comparison section of our PowerPoint presentation, we're going to talk about the third point of the third stage of the crisis, which is the post-crisis events and what you do to clean up after the mess. So that's what we're going to be talking about now. And you go to pages 426 to 428 in order to find guidance in the textbook to do this. Okay, now this is how we open our evaluation and comparison section of your paper in this PowerPoint presentation. Question number 4 also guides you on this in this regard, from page 423 of the textbook
describe the trigger event. So let's go back and take a look now. Now that we're in this evaluation and comparison stage, let's go back and look at the trigger event. Now that we've got the literature review all set out, now that we've talked about the leadership failures and the organizational failures, let's go back and retrace our steps about the trigger event. And once again, just bullet points on the slide, maybe a few images at this point in time. If you got some great pictures, I love seeing pictures. While you're talking to me, my eyes are busy looking at a picture. If somebody's got some good journalism, photojournalism done on this topic, then show me faces, show me people, show me cities, show me tragedy, if it was actually a tragedy. Give me something that's going to make me feel it in my gut while you're telling me the story. Now that we've got the benefit of all of this other information, let's go back and look at that trigger event from through another lens so that we understand this more clearly. Once again, questions number 11 and 12, I'm going to refer you back to this slide here. Present and defend an argument that ties it all together. What we talked about, they said, the literature review, I said, which is the leadership failures and the organizational failures, and now we're tying it all together in this final section, evaluation and comparison. So that's what we're doing now, tying it all together. That brings us to the conclusion. All trainers typically follow these three guidelines. This guides them in all of their training sessions. After they've got their training session all together, they look at it and they say, okay, well, have I done this? Tell them what you're going to tell them before you start. That's your introduction. Tell them, in this case it's the literature review, the leadership failures, organizational failures, the comparison and evaluation. And now we are at the conclusion, which is in the bottom right corner here, and I'm just going to tell them what I told them. And that's all you have to do in the conclusion. Very short, one single slide, tell them what you told them. The final slide that I want to see from you will be your references in APA style. I've given you the one reference, that's the Johnson textbook. I want to see 2 more peer-reviewed sources at least, as a minimum. Any other claims that you've made, you will also have to cite them. You don't just have to make 3 citations. If you've made a claim anywhere, including the story itself, I should have already put up here the citation from San Francisco Gate newspaper, because that is the web domain where I pulled this from. So I need to cite the source of my story because I've had it all through here and I failed to actually cite it. So that would cost me points. But as a minimum, I need you to cite Johnson, and I need you to cite 2 peer-reviewed sources. And anything else that you touched on that supported a claim, you need to cite it, especially the story itself. Now, back here to the introduction, what did I say we were going to come back to? We were going to come back to our thesis statement. Now that I've got all of this together and I've got all of these slides together and I can flip through them very quickly, take a look at your thesis sentence, make sure that it is tight and focused and deals very, very narrowly with the scandal or issue that you're talking about and the results that you found in your comparison and evaluation section. So your thesis statement should pull something from your comparison and evaluation section, because that's what you're building everything toward. So take a look at it again, make sure that your thesis sentence is something you're satisfied with. Reword the whole thesis paragraph, which, remember, is the first paragraph in the entire paper, and the thesis sentence is the last sentence of that opening paragraph. So fix those up now, and then go back and look at your title and just confirm that your title narrows in like a laser on what you have included in your new thesis sentence. And that's it. That's how to do a sample presentation. Once again, do the PowerPoint slides for me. If you can, embed your audio right in the PowerPoint. If you can't do that, if you haven't got the technology or the savvy on how to do that, at least record your audio as a single track or 2 tracks. It'll help me if you can record it as a single track on your cell phone and then text that to me. But if your kid's crying in the middle and you need to stop it, then just keep track of how many tracks there are and say, if in my case my last name's Leavitt, I would say Leavitt, clip number 1, Leavitt, clip number 2, Leavitt, clip number 3. So that when I put them in the folder for you students, I know what order to play them in as I'm looking through the slide. Alright, that's it. Good luck on your presentations. I'm looking forward to seeing them. Also, remember, your best effort on your draft at this stage and submitting it on Sunday may save you from actually doing any revisions at all. So the better your paper is on Sunday when you submit it, the higher the chance is that you're not going to have to do any additional work after Sunday on your paper. You'll be able to just focus on the final exam. Thanks.